Good evening. Welcome to the School of Visual Arts. Welcome back to the School of Visual Arts. I'm Tom Hoon. I chair the BFA program in Visual and Critical Studies, and we are sponsoring this evening's reading, really. First reading we've had in a couple of years. We're very excited about it. We're very fortunate to have with us this evening David Matlin. I'll tell you a little bit about David. He's a professor, but he's also a poet, novelist, and an essayist who teaches writing at San Diego State University. David received his PhD in English from SUNY Buffalo, where he studied with both Angus Fletcher, has a wonderful book on allegory, and the poet Robert Creeley. Professor Matlin's dissertation work was on the writings of the poet and the visionary William Blake. And David Matlin's published a good number of books, both fiction and nonfiction. Among the best known of his nonfiction works is the 2005 book titled Prisons, Inside the New America, From Vernicool Creek to Abu Ghraib. That book is also the product of his more than 10 years of teaching in the New York State penal system. It's a book that has earned high praise from both Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn. David's 1993 novel, How the Night is Divided, was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award. And then just last year, in 2012, David published with Hen Press the novel A HalfMan Dreaming, from which he'll be reading tonight. So too will David, true? Yeah. Good. So too will David read from his most recent collection, published only this year, titled Up Fish Creek Road and Other Stories. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Matlin.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to read from the beginning of A HalfMan Dreaming just to give you an idea of the kind of prose that I've been writing, and how that prose influenced the passages of a short story that I'm going to read from this collection that just came out with a Brooklyn publication called Spuyten Duyvil, and they publish a really very lovely list, and I feel very fortunate to have this book with them. Part of what I'm going to read tonight also has to do with my native landscape, because I'm a Californian who was raised primarily in the deserts, and part of the concentration, particularly in the piece that I'm going to read from the short story collection, has to do with the San Joaquin Valley. And to give you a kind of background, the San Joaquin Valley is where, well, it's probably the single largest breadbasket on the planet in terms of its capacity to feed millions upon millions of people. It's partly where I was raised as a boy, and in the 19th century, before the gold rush took place, this was a site of some of the most sophisticated American Indian tribal peoples that we know of anywhere, and all of those people were destroyed by the beginning of the 20th century. And during the invasion by the Anglo-Americans and gold miners during the 19th century, this was an area that contained a lake called Tulare Lake, and it was a lake that was 250 miles long and over 80 miles wide. It was a tremendous inland sea, and millions of birds migrated through this area of the Great California Central Valley. And the settlers created these cannons that could kill 10,000 birds at a time. So much of this material refers to the background of this, and also to the background of growing up in Southern California. So what I thought I'd do was read one paragraph, the opening paragraph from this newest novel, just to give you an idea of the velocity and propulsion of the kind of prose that I hear, and then move that material over to this collection of short stories. I seem to be working in opposites often. I think a lot of writers will tell you that writing short stories moved them toward the novel, but in my own instance, writing the novel moved me toward the short story because it gave me a sense of how to direct myself to what might, in my own mind, be considered a deeper narrative process. And much of my own narrative process also includes a sense of how to come to the evocation of landscapes both through description, tonality, and emotion, and how to create the kind of vocabulary that might be necessary for this. I began my attempts to become an artist and was very interested at first in becoming a painter and had begun painting. And then in the midst of that initiation, realized that what I wanted to do most was to become a writer. So let me read from this book, which is called A HalfMan Dreaming, and the opening passage, which won't take very long. With this, and this, I think, will give you an idea of how to hear this material. I was used to seeing the factories, the scrubbed, clean ones with low roofs where you needed a great-grandmother from the American Revolution to get work clearance. You got to put together torpedoes and missiles with atomic nuclear warheads. Take your time, microtune those fuckers so that they wouldn't even leave a stain. You could come home to your girlfriend, have her wrap her legs around your back in the back seat of your Dodge Hemi, and know she couldn't even begin to ask how your day went. That it was top secret, installing gyroscopes, the angular rotation of your nighttime hours in their pitch, yaw, and roll. Maybe you could do it 8 hours a day, get to love to drop DMT, tell your head it steadied your fingers, sing the same little rodent song that Annette or Darlene sang, and have that girlfriend strap on a Mickey Mouse hat, suck and pull your nipples raw, stretch your anus with her hungry wanting fingers, and if you let it become an image, where would its eating stop or begin? What would those industries surrounding the death of being another gold rush, and moving between that flow of money and how it could customize a car, buy inboard race boats with blown, injected Chryslers in the northwest wastes of the Mekong Delta, where cults and profit seem to appear out of a nowhere equal to any Southern California parking lot, the mutual power of incantation, licking, calling everyone to a passage, and whether it was beyond cure, only death's part in the rescue's price would tell. Ripened, who can be ripened as the moon is eaten and may never come back, warped maze of swollen earth 1 finger tall. Hell particularly stinks, they thought. In all their scrolls, the dead in the land of the dead are represented by a fart, and they're the most beautiful jewelry to be worn or the freshest eyes of the dying. Much of my work takes place in Southern California. It is, I suppose, by birth, I'm from a very old family that came into this world in 1769. So it's a long experience. The piece that I'm going to read from is called A Mud-Loosened Tree. And it evokes this world of the San Joaquin Valley. When wood's thickness won't do, Dr. Blanchard wondered how that phrase from his mother's spring observations, mixed with the sense of raw garlic, washing over this corner of land he'd been assigned to as a conscientious objector, Sanger, California, the small town lying in its bed of 1942 midsummer heat. The news of the war, in both the Pacific and Europe, came in savage dribblings, and no one in those months after his arrival was sure either of him or of a victory, which seemed as remote as the Sequoian giants hovering in the Sierras, where he went sometimes to draw and write and organize his medical notes on patients. The people he treated, though they needed medical care, were suspicious and often overtly distant. One result was the grinding isolation of his young daughter and son. The other, his wife, who had become increasingly moody. His alternative service was based on his Quaker beliefs, not just in nonviolence, but the adorable mercy of peace and its defiance of the sword as a truth still in search of completion. He did not think his devotions were mystical and would have scorned such notions as deep and useless. as deep and useless pretension that had nothing to do with his practice of medicine among the people he gently treated and respected, who thought he was either an odd foreign agent or a temptation whose kindnesses were to be used and then discarded. Joe Blanchard was up most mornings by 4 a.m., tending to births, fevers, infections, sunstroke, discoveries of cancer, and farm injuries which included lost fingers, lost arms, lacerations, and sometimes just drunken angers over work, going to dead marriages, the moveless, looming high Sierras that seemed to scavenge men's dreams, broke them, and prompted them toward carelessness in its translations into women and men and children with cut lips and bruises. Dr. Blanchard also knew the constant weighing of absent sons and occasional daughters on faraway islands or continents killing and dying, nursing and being killed, everyone home and homesick, scared and trying not to be scared, but being cinched tighter and tighter as to a sneaking sort of drought in its rainlessness, its swirls in a kind of helpless barrenness over the terrible war so distant and so horribly near. House calls, mothers and kids, the young fathers going to proverbs that evaporate the living. Add to this recipe, he noted one morning, my own intrusions. The absences of young men going off to war inclined those who were left to feel like leftovers as a workable, partially maimed condition of their lives. The young, not of war-age boys, girls, women, and older men, had to somehow fill the space of desertions no one at that point knew the end of. Dr. Blanchard's arrival, a healthy war-age man and medical doctor, escorted by wife and children, caused many who saw or heard of him to sulk, as one might in the beginning, over a leaf-eating caterpillar or two, observed while watering and seeing to a peach or plum grove, not a threat, but a small disorder that would allow no further gathering. A doctor's skills, sure we need him, but our boys need him more. And what the hell kind of doctor is this anyways, who'd let himself ride it out with the wife and kids while a million others bleed alone? No one really wanted questions like this to take root because of Dr. Blanchard's fine care and gentle way. A doctor's doctor, rare enough, and don't make you feel like a dog, neither one of the isolate first settlement ranchers was heard to say while getting once-a-month supplies in town, as if that pound of saying might dispel what sometimes grows best in any seasons of rainlessness, seeds of gossip which the rancher pointed out can sprout in a drop of piss or a pinch of fire by way of a reminder that though the war ran deep, it hadn't yet conspired to make a total waste of their world, that they could still see it and live it every day, and trust could start with one man going to another for simple help. Theo was the rancher's name. His father, a Civil War veteran, had come into the Sierra foothills in 1870 or so, when the San Joaquin still had grizzlies and Tule elk herds and sky-blackening migratory bird flocks that took as much decided concentration to kill off as Indians. No formal count, but it was by the millions. And my dad arrived in the last stages of the slaughter, an amputee whose one arm and hand Joe Blanchard heard from the 50-and-more-year-old son and other older patients had more than enough strength. The understatement holding to itself, even after 7 decades, a respectful austerity having to do not only with physical strength, but the fact that he sheltered the occasional desperate Indians who came his way, would not allow any murderings, and was said to have broken the backs of 2 or 3 Indian shooters who couldn't seem to let go of earlier habits along with an expected bounty and received with equally applied understatement some payment for their trouble. Theo's father stayed his remaining life among these people, in that way, a kind of precisely defined but not distressful embarrassment, reminding those who had gotten, in those murderous years, to place in the whispered local terms how the gottings took place. And the town wasn't always glad about Theo, thought what had landed under the tree had a full complement of body parts. Otherwise, that was probably the only difference. Dr. Blanchard had treated Theo, going partially talkless doc, about to turn into a bad neighbor as the physician held the older man's arthritic hands, touched them at their various swollen points, asked that fingers be flexed and unflexed, and then said little could be done. A good soaking in hot water once or twice a day with a shot of a man's favorite whiskey would ease things up a notch or two, hold back at least some of the pain. The hard rancher noted how the physician had conducted the house call, rode the nearly trackless 15 miles, took notes, asked questions, keeping in mind he was a stranger asking these questions that needed some precision so as not to pull up the wrong weeds about who'd died, who'd got sick and who didn't, and from what, and knew enough about horses, cattle, the smell of fall in the air, and color of midday sun to attract his 4 half-wild dogs. And the minor earthquake that took place while the general practitioner held the older man's hands. The walls of the house swaying, chairs seeming to float a yard one way, then back approximately to their original position. And outside, the windmill creaking, the live oaks in their livid, twisted rupture, hovering over a creek, dropping some of their limbs, a crack appearing in one of the oldest trunks that would surely kill the tree in the last 5 of its 500-year life. The hills lifting up mists of displaced dust. The doctor placing his glasses properly again on the bridge of his nose when the swaying stopped, as if this were also a part of his vocation, not exactly companionable, but supposable, as the rattlesnake bites he also sometimes treated, if he could get to the victim or the victim to him on time. Theo did ask, though, what is a doctor doing? Theo did not ask, though, what is a doctor doing here? He could readily see for himself what was being done to the best of one man's abilities, pouring an intelligence into the daily needs of a practice, keeping the hours exact and spare so as to get to know patients and their ways. He left the question up to his neighbors and fellow townsmen. It was to Theo a democracy, and young men and women were dying for the price of such painful inquiries as the one beginning to emerge in the valley that shifted and trembled below him. More than that, an old Theo saddled up a horse to ride fences or shoot a hawk, taken up a habit of raiding his chickens. It wasn't that thought was certain, but that there were certainties, and the immediate business was to know how far they'd come and go. Otherwise, the exposed fronts caused a man to slow down some and sharpen his knife. The rancher had also fought in World War I, and the doctor, as he examined the increasingly arthritic hands, noticed the burns on wrists and forearms. Mustard gas. Joe Blanchard looked up into Theo's eyes. Can still see the fog making its mess, Doc. Part of my lungs, too. Not enough yet to stop breathing, though. Haven't seen such burns very often, Theo, as the younger man touched the still traumatized skin, applied stethoscope to chest, listened, took a salve from his bag, left it on the kitchen table and said, "When you run out, I'll get more." Theo remembered equally the young doctor's hands. His fingers were short, the flesh thick, and seemed unrelated to the physician's tall, thin body until he touched a patient's veins or joints or felt under an armpit. It was hot that day, 110 degrees and more, and the younger man was grateful for the lunch of cool well water, hard-boiled eggs, and smoked venison, along with some pick-me-up slices of lemon, peaches, and a pot of fresh honey. Never had a better lunch, Theo, and never expected fruit or water this good. Father hauled the first trees on a pack horse, made sure they wouldn't get too rain-resistant and break someone's teeth. Got a small orchard now and some hives. Any more rain than the valley? Can't say much more, but the snow piles up pretty good. Poor man's fertilizer won't get anyone rich up here, but down there it attracts the funniest gamblers ready for their hand of poker with the creation. No other way I know to think about farming or ranching. Beautiful a devil is ever boiled up in a man's mess of dreamings, depending on your brand. If you're ever ready to try it, Doc, let me know. Think I'll let that epidemic pass me by for now. Theo liked the younger man's refusal. Its lightness gathered, but not too hard, and it was, with a little rummaging, given to the form of leisurely ambiguities that caught Theo's respect for men who might find a way to belong anywhere in any world without having to scheme. Yep, don't come looking for no company up here, Theo added with a touch of the listener grown shrewd before the slippage of his own words. Cattle running okay? helps away fighting the war, but the sons help out when they can. Dr. Blanchard knew Theo had sent at least 4 of the sons and daughters of his hired workers to college, and that the town whispered about this, the gossip reaching to Fresno and beyond, the too easy whispering about wasting money on Mexicans, Indians, Okies, the local and not so local people sneering over the thought, the intolerable proclamation of it. The other, perhaps more fearful whispers had to do with Theo's boyhood, especially his earliest fascinations with geology and the rock-boiled world that thrust itself up nearly 3 miles and held only the most fleeting possibilities for both the prosperous and the damned who might inject themselves with its invitations. As a child, he was a rock hound, didn't you know? And as if that would explain a certain kind of helpless error, akin to retardation, or worse, a calling of the Spirit lying outside the local Christian appetites for the rapture, and any messages to be sent to the sinful inhabitants of the fallen world. The boy's wanderings in places like Kings Canyon pose for the most faithful and devoted and insidious mischief, and a committee was gotten together once before the turn of the century for a visit. Those visitors one Monday after the Sabbath saddled up some horses and for insurance took wives with baskets of food in case of some sort of trouble, said a local pastor. Fear of God must have made him unafraid to hide behind a woman's skirt, was the comment Theo's father was said to have whispered through his gritted teeth about the incident. The party of 5 rode up into the foothills, their horses and a mule to carry water, and even a passenger if the footing became too loose or hazardous. The journey was said to take then 5 hours, late spring in that 3rd year after Theo's mother's death. Sun was full out, so too the rattlesnakes and scorpions. And there were still scattered grizzlies in those decades, as well as Yokut and Miwok burials with fine baskets the ladies used to decorate their parlors. The mother died a year after the son's birth, valley fever, it was said. The mysterious infection named after the San Joaquin itself, but also called desert rheumatism, may be because no one knew what the hell else to say about such kinds of dyings. Theo told Dr. Blanchard as he took his notes, "Son of a bitch wind," my father was heard to mumble when he'd gone a shot too far into whiskey after his visits to her grave, no one knowing in those decades what it was. Middle finger was where hers began, a small abscess along with the flu, and some pain in the right side, not a thought more than that, as it was told to me, other than rest in bed for a day, 2 at most. Skin boils came, the other crushing headache, hallucinations, whole thing carried her off like the petal of a poppy without touching me or my dad. Dr. Blanchard listened carefully. He'd seen other less dangerous symptoms, but ones that were persistent in their deliberations, fatigue lasting for years, a month only without explanation. No one knew exactly how it might turn out once the infection came. Dr. Blanchard knew its name, coccidioides, a fungus hibernating in the dry alkaline soils, stirred by wind or hoe, tractor blade, a simple footstep, and flying like some misaligned pollen from an earlier geologic age, to the lungs of more recent species, human and non-human. The physician, knowing the name, knew too that wasn't quite enough. The disease was often difficult, chronic, so he noted Theo's story, having already attempted to treat others. The husband with his war-ravaged body later thought, when grief had subsided and he carried his longings after that for the boy, about not wanting any further wonder as to which or what woman found dismembered men attractive. So he watched the small procession climbing toward the plateau, the retreat he constructed before his wife's death to escape the stifling summer heat of the valley. The women with long dresses and hats and scarves to ward off sun and wind. The men stiffly suited, riding their horses badly. He had a world to water, a cow ready to drop a calf so as to show his son birth. He looked at the surrounding granite spires looming over his 1,000-acre plateau, with its arroyos and year-round streams, stands of oak and sycamore, and cottonwood and wild-flowered shadows, knew it would all still be around when the uninvited arrived. Amputation at the shoulder of his left arm, a sniper at Chickamauga, the inflammation of the Cherokee name, River of Death, rising up, perhaps as terrible as the original bullet itself, to send those parts of his body into hungers more rapacious in their invisibilities than the visible at the farthest boundaries its senescence could bear or comprehend. Such personal speculation had risen up out of the absence, as Theo's father referred to it, the ocean where the soul might swim, having its shores reduced. So he walked 2,000 miles, learning in that after-war immensity to redirect the balance of his body, and it appeared to those who reluctantly marveled over it that he had far more arms than the countable, comprehensible one, with a hand that could lift a common man up to dangle in the air, which he'd done when necessary, to prove that the end of the day will surely come, and to further surprise the unsuspecting with the hid mysteries of the landscape. Born on Long Island, father's people fishermen, mother's people's farmers. In 1839, far from the clank of crowds, he was heard to say, adding, "I too started from Paumanok," and recited Whitman's poem to his son as they shod and checked horses' teeth, chopped wood, and built a local fortune from land purchases. And when the Southern Pacific came, that too, sending crops of fruit around the world. Sagaponack, the exact place of birth, and a boyhood spent exploring the local bays with their old, defiantly firm names, the depths of their insinuations not yet broken at that point, when he canoed as a 15-year-old the watery swells of the Chicanak, the Peconic, and Maupig bays. He liked both fishing and farming, but the storms and tides of the sea drew him more against his uncle's fate, his mother's beloved brother, following a plow horse, turned up a nest of ground hornets and was stung to death. And he, the nephew, could smell the currents, had an eye for sea distances, lay for sea colors, bones for weather. There was no decision, really, no dilation of the will, along with the memory of his uncle, bloated in his suffocation from at least 200 stings. The plow horse found nearly a mile away, pulling at tufts of seagrass on a dune overlooking the Atlantic, with 20 or 30 dead hornets woven into the mangy disarray of its tail. What his pre-Civil War memories allowed him against the mountainous creature horrors which wanted to immerse him, he knew, as another ocean memory could barely resist. The waters of Long Island Sound, cutting his arms and shoulders from the thinning ice of early spring to the thickening ices of early winter. The haul of fish and nets, his and other waterlogged faces, fish and net weight cutting at his endurance. The smell and glistened bodies of sea lions waiting for their thefts, ocean spray burning his ears and eyelids, heaving sea and horizon close to the nose, porpoise timing their watchful passages into the air with the heavy or light undulance of sea swell. Keep an extra eye for sharks, and if you got one, an extra hand, the elder fisherman joked. Their own nostrils wet with sea-washed fish oil, fish blood, hair and ears under that sun glinted with scales of freshly clubbed sea creatures, the piles of flesh fish ripe and slippery, and one needed to watch for the clandestine gaff prong which could butcher either men or that unlucky sea serpent come for its lone mistake. One midday meal, along with a bowl of steaming quahogs, his mother set beside his feast for her son, the collection of Walt Whitman's poems, Leaves of Grass, which he memorized and recited to himself as he either restrung or set nets, the labors and the poet's phrasing, setting a pace that brought him into and through the days without feeling like a heaped-up shade. The book of poems appeared in his 16th year, 1855. When he later asked his mother about the gift, her explanation was a fellow Long Islander had written them, as if that response might admit light into shadow, escorted by the calming practicalities of household chores as relief from the glancing darknesses which had stolen the life of her brother. On that basis, the family subscribed to the Freeman, Whitman's newspaper in Brooklyn, and though it more often came late or not at all, Theo's grandfather read the news, avidly looked for the poet's journalism, and recited it to Theo's grandmother as she prepared Sunday chowder, baked bread, planned her gardens for the summer. The maternal great-grandmother, her name was Ora, as if the tones of the central consonant, encircled by the orbiting vowels, were a well-footed, not at all unpleasant solar system, which in its gatherings also included her habit of befriending a new female goose of each generation who cried whenever she, the mistress of the farm, was seen to leave by those other feathered mistresses and protectors of the barnyard. She preferred not to be aligned, however, with any members of the family of orators, no matter how persuasive, except the one who struck the deepest chords of her admirations, Elias Hicks. Both her own and the Whitman family had gone to hear the great and compelling Quaker theologian, whom the poet in 1888 recalled in a scrupulous, intimate prose, the recollection tender and close, Whitman remembering himself as a boy of 9, no more than 10, and his father's voice calling, "Come, mother, Elias preaches tonight," and the young Walt allowed to go. 4 years before his death, the old, partially paralyzed poet wrote of the Quaker speaker's agonizing conviction and magnetic stream of natural eloquence, different as the fresh air of a May morning or seashore breeze from the atmosphere of a perfumer's shop. In trying to define and hold, after 60 years, the presence of Elias Hicks, a fellow Long Islander from Hempstead Township, Whitman said in his essay, "There is a sort of nature of persons I have compared to little rills of water, fresh from perennial springs, and the comparison is indeed an appropriate one. Persons not so very plenty, yet some few certainly of them running over the surface and area of humanity, all times, all lands, sparse, not numerous, yet enough to irrigate the soil." Theo, in his boyhood, wanting to have a more definite sense of his father's origins and what look the faraway Paumanok had, was shown another paragraph from this essay his father thought contained some of the expressions he would only stumble before, though he had been sharpened and fashioned by his apprenticeship of waking and discovering such sea and landscapes. "How will I remember the region, the flat plains of the middle Long Island, as then, with their prairie-like vistas and grassy patches in every direction, and the kill-calf and herds of cattle and sheep, then the South Bay and shores and the salt meadows, and the sedgy smell and numberless little bayous and hummock islands in the waters, the habit of every sort of fish and aquatic fowl of North America, and the baymen, a strong, wild, peculiar race now extinct, or rather entirely changed, and the beach outside the sandy bars, sometimes many miles at a stretch, with their old history of wrecks and storms, the weird, white-gray beach, not without its tales of pathos, tales, too, of grandest heroes and heroisms, the fragment from Whitman also calling for and giving courage, something about hands tight to the throats of kings. Theo memorized the passage and asked about its details as he examined the geological wonders surging thousands of feet into the skies of his own home ground. The father, at that point, in his son's obvious growing hungers for knowledge and curiosity, committed himself to the writing of a kind of stack of memories, each of them to be thought of as a bale of hay, personally harvested, bound, and stored up as a pile, along with Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and John Muir's The Mountains of California, with its descriptions of the bee pastures, plains of wild flowers, creating various auras of light as far as the eye could trace the luxuriant sheets of wild colors vanishing into the distant hazes, interspersed by groves of ancient oak, casting their interlacing shadows and producing a sense in the walker of waiting in liquid gold, full of birdsong and waves of fragrance. How would one, in a time even of Theo's emerging adulthood, just mere decades from these witnesses, consider their truths before the carnage-like transformations of those spaces? The ambushed womb of shadows, Theo's father quoted Whitman, trying to release both himself and his son from the bitterness of those negations and their powers. Maidu, Winton, Yokit, Miwok. Theo liked to wrap these syllables into his explorations of the high meadows and granite fastnesses which surrounded his boyhood world, looking for bighorn, the remnant herds at his end of the sequoia country, not yet destroyed by the hoofed locusts, as Muir called the domestic sheep introduced directly after the gold rush, denuding ancient forage and meadows, spreading disease for which the wild ungulates had no immunities. The second, the sound of the rut, the bloodshot, smaller thunder of the male bighorn collisions, echoing off ice-grooved cliff faces, was one of his favorite observances and studies. Though it too, strong as it appeared to be in its immense sensualities and desperations, was tentative. That word striking the ancient syllables of Indian nouns he pronounced below the warping granite spires with everything of a language clipped off but a core of leftover hanging sorrows. The older mustard gas-scarred rancher told the Quaker doctor that as a boy he still saw many of the western hills covered with the original gray-green and green grasses rather than the brown and golden forms that strike the mind in a sweep of sun-creased, grudging distances. Wouldn't believe it, Doc, but those old colors offered a gentleness to these spaces as the Quaker watched the rancher almost sight the trail of his words moving toward the stories where no famine marked the earlier dwellers in a region rich in rivers, marshes, swamps, fed by the unimaginably huge yearly snowpack melt of the Sierra Nevada and pelagic plains where tule elk, deer, pronghorn antelope, and grizzly bear grazed lakes and riverine mazes provided nutrient plants, trout, salmon, and migratory birds. Foundation for thousands of years, Doc, where the great valley oaks and their acorns cleared enough room for 30 human languages. Come up here at night and you can see the lights of small towns named Tulamni, Mukalomni, Chowchilla, Kawea, and in invoking the extinct vocabulary and its strangeness, Dr. Blanchard thought at that moment the thick finalities, as if they too were geologic forces, might shrink back with the pronunciation of these isolate but still breathed relics. Some say those speakers didn't have a word for war or peace. And as Theo let the speculation settle on the paradox of that double absence, Dr. Blanchard, the modern Quaker in the shadow of a second 20th century world war, thought of William Penn's Holy Experiment and how the founder of that province had been generous and scrupulously fair with the Indians, believing each of their ideals regarding justice were much the same, and that both peoples could live side by side in peace. It took only 100 years, the younger man remembered, from those living moments when the founder was most creative in kindness, and what he, the young physician, thought was the recognition of the carnal presence of the cross to remind women and men of the holiness of their dying and having lived, to the deadened seconds when the grandson, John Penn, in 1763 proclaimed a bounty for all Indian scalps, sending the grandfather's holy experiment into howling ruin. Theo's father knew the small contingent of townspeople, held the boy's studies and wanderings in the same suspicions as the fossil skulls of sea lions and whale vertebrae uncovered by the spring floods of valley rivers, or by the simplest act of applying hoe to soil in an innocent garden where the upheavals of the fallen world could challenge the purest forbearances of the devout, upturning Satan's vulgarities poised as the cleverest lie before the real age of the creation. And the boy, after being allowed to read the works of von Humboldt, Lyell, von Weyrich, and the Lord's acutest enemy, Charles Darwin, would explain to other children the Miocene or Pliocene fossil leaf impressions in rock or animal skull fragments, and huge shark's teeth aswim in the roots of peach trees, a backyard patch of a good believer's simple strawberries. He carried in his pockets weren't 3,000 or 4,000 years old, but 30 to 50 million, an exaltation of the abyss. One prominent minister's wife, hearing of Theo's facts, actually broke one of her molars over the thought of her children receiving such terrible sorts of vice, and so swept up her skirts along with others for this visit. The Civil War veteran understood the party had a kind of natural force to its determinations, and thought for a moment some well-placed this side of fatal bullets would be a welcome rain, but one, no matter the intent, that'd land all over Theo. For himself, harm had little mystery to it, arriving as it could or must, dry or moist. The two extremities a sort of cluster, reminding him of the where he had come from, and his arrival in this valley, which seemed to attract in its seasons mist and rain, wind and lightning, dust storms, and a summer heat to turn the nerves into a vocation of threat, one to upturn trees or snap off a roof like it was a piece of brittle fingernail, the other to char a horse from mane to hoof, kill anything trapped in a too open space, the mind-searing snap of thunder equal to the dispossessing explosive tremors which on-foot beast or person, ship-size boulders from a 100,000-year perch. He and Theo, watching the huge cliffs for those seconds, tremble as parts of what had been 4,000 or 5,000-foot faces of sheer granite walls turn to a peculiar dust at these moments. The solidity of any present world, as he thought then, to be drifting and splitting as these 5 people were drifting toward him. The lead woman's husband had helped to bring to the railroad Leland Stanford's personal letter, guaranteeing lasting prosperity, was displayed in framed glass hanging prominently in the man's study, and with it the exportation of every crop a farmer's imagination could force upon any soil, and begin from there a transformation into salt. He was a childhood acquaintance of Theo's mother, and had been in the process of courting when the Civil War veteran arrived afoot in a dangerous country, as the locals still had it and reported it. He had in those years been mostly afoot from Sagaponack, came home from 1865 to late 1867 to recuperate, help, and be helped by his family, and to begin reading again his beloved Whitman, and the image for him of Benjamin Franklin in last days, praying that God grant us that not only love of liberty, but a thorough knowledge of the rights of man may pervade all the nations of the earth, that the whole world be home for everyone. But he didn't any longer quite know what home was, and in thinking about both the printer and the poet from Long Island, his works of seeing and hearing were a discord the newly one-armed man felt was irresistible, felt that if he didn't walk, he would rot. It was in the beginning for balance. He didn't know anymore how to literally hold himself. The sensations of falling over on one side, feeling undermined, betrayed in the visible, this other portion residing in death, pulling at him, his family also unable to bear his anguish. So he set out one morning in 1867 to try to regain what poise there was left for him. What would nature, without check, with original energy be, every hazard of it permitted to speak, as if that possible freest speech could quell the stale, residual war sensations that aroused a craving in himself for something just this side of disintegration, to bluff his grief, his unworthiness before the deadnesses he'd personally conjured and could not subdue, walking, as his mother said one night through her tears, as if he were a mud-loosened tree about to fall on everyone. He took new courage from where, anywhere, he could find it, and distinctly from the lines of Song of Myself. Undrape, you who are not guilty to me, nor stale, nor discarded. He went out and netted fish with his father for that last month, fish and boat and sea weight, making his hand and wrist throb and burn, the wave lurch, the bunching, slanting heave pressing at him, and the stump of his shoulder. He desired to meet the poet, but he was gun-shy. The weight of a rifle, the small mounds of blood-stained bullets, unhinged teeth next to a man's body, the moments when hate had taken him in hand-to-hand combat frenzy. He had killed with the bayonet, and that made him shy, as he remembered equally stray fragments and phrases from the Song of the Open Road. None may come to the trial till he or she brings courage and health, or these are the days that must happen to you. Their insinuations made him withdraw further, and there seemed less and less any safe distance to withdraw to. The fish which he hauled in, learning the world of one-handedness and its smallest rituals, from grooming to dressing, staring even at the disfigure, wondering at his sleeper's weight and where it would land him, sorting through that unreality, the privacy of himself, corpse-like, dazed with the busy peculiarities of it. His mother smoked fish, dried apples, prepared for, at the most as she knew it, had to be 2 weeks of his journey, wanting her war-broken son not to die, and no longer knowing what his life was nor how to keep him alive. That morning, in late spring of 1867, it was before sunrise, and his mother cooked his favorite breakfast of pancakes with fresh churned butter, maple syrup, blueberry jam, thick slices of bacon, milk directly from the udder, rich and warm and creamy. His pack with a copy of the poet's book and its additions to 1867, fresh cobbled boots, fresh clothes, a walking stick his father carved from black walnut and whalebone. The leave-taking was quiet. He remembered his mother kept her hands under her apron, his father ready for his own day, fixing nets and boats for a new fishing season at sea, those hands forever swollen, more callous than skin, every finger broken at least once, these images almost more than his parents' faces, a parasitic anguish at the beginning of his journey, fixed to the smells of kitchen and heavy thaw breezes that seemed to stick under the lids of his eyes. He could barely swallow her mother's lovingly prepared food. The dawn filled with robins hopping, the deliberate, careful, stuttering motions of their listenings helped to rouse him, as did the returning Canadian geese, the fierce, watchful ganders that awed him as a boy and man with their deliberate courage whenever the hint of threat appeared to the resting, ground-born flock, the taste of pancake and kelp-tinged wind on his lips. The journey took 3 years. In the winter, he stopped and offered himself as a laborer for farming families in Ohio. At first, the suppositions were a torture and threat of starvation. A Civil War veteran was fine, but a one-armed man and Yankee? What could he do that wouldn't embarrass their charity? Such creatures came back to their home countrysides, many to give up, become drunks either of various violences or passivities, become a shambles gathered at the corners of everyone's eye. The mutilations pure and simple in that way, filling the villages and towns with a watchful futility. And here was yet another drifting through under what terms of vagrancy? Without work, for food, no food. The simple mathematical reduction harbored no lies. He had to think of equally simple questions. The simple, granite-like, merciless bunching against him demanded it. The visible cliffs of King's Canyon which surrounded him, he later thought, wonderful as they were the awkward twins to the more invisible geology he earlier experienced on the shores of the Ohio River as it plunged toward the Mississippi and the edges of the Confederacy. Was he the erysipeloid of Whitman's Sleepers, the idiot, or one of the transient meteors disappearing from the poet's year of forebodings at the precipices of the Civil War? A day, let me show you what I can do in a day, he offered without beggary, wondering at that point what kind of slow ruin a 3,000-mile walk could visit on a man, one like himself, hauling death, not by name, but by the breathless residues, come to drink at the springs of hostility he could not discard. And he saw himself asking this question as if he were the single actor in a traveling carnival offering carefully chosen temptation. He was as surprised by these words as the farmer who, with thinning hesitation, allowed him exactly that, a day to do what? Stack and fork hay. Thank you. This story actually goes on for quite some number of pages and ends with the attempted lynching of the doctor.
David has generously offered to take any questions or comments you might want to provide.
Any questions you'd like? Ask the first question. Ask the one that exposes you as a fool, and that'll be the best question you could ask me. I didn't know anybody who resembled Theo. I made it up. All of that is made up. I mean, I knew facsimiles of persons growing up in the kind of ranching world that composes my boyhood. And that ranching world was a very different California than the one that exists now. I grew up in a rural background where you could ride a horse 50 miles and not see anybody. And we grew up also with the legends of Joaquin Murrieta and other great legendary banditos, and would go out and play cowboys and Indians with real guns in the Chino Hills. I don't even know how we made it out of it alive. Shooting 22s in each other and bows and arrows and all kinds of things. We grew up with horses very early, and we're really good at it. But this is a world that no longer really exists. I consider California to be one of the great tragedies. I've traveled, not as extensively as I might have, but I've traveled, and the world that I grew up in was so extraordinarily beautiful, and it's all dead. And I might add that I don't want to see that happen to your world. And I think it's very important to think about that, because I think of myself as the first generation of parents. My own son is in here and teaches at the School of Visual Arts. And the world that he grew up in was really quite beautiful. And that's being destroyed quite quickly, too. But for myself, the first great impact of seeing the destruction of such an extraordinary world has never left my mind. And I look upon that as an act of the most gruesome kind of warfare I can possibly think about. So how does one confront this? How does one begin to think about these issues? So, in this activity of research, I think about John Muir a great deal. I think about Darwin. I think about Thoreau and others. Right now, in the composition of a new novel, I'm thinking primarily of Alexander Wilson in the present passages that I've been writing. And Alexander Wilson was the founder of American ornithology and had a huge impact on John James Audubon. Just an incredible impact. And if you look at Alexander Wilson's work, you can see how Audubon took from him almost immediately. And this man came from Scotland. He was a weaver and part of a revolutionary activity in Glasgow in the 18th century. And he must have walked at least 30 to 50,000 miles when he came to America, recording every bird he came into contact with. And if you think about the description of those North American skies at that point, there were passenger pigeons. And some of these flocks numbered 3 to 10 billion birds in one flock. They blackened the sky. You don't have that experience anymore, and either do I. That experience has not been part of our experience as Americans since the middle of the 19th century, when all of this was destroyed. So when I write about the San Joaquin Valley, the largest number of grizzly bears in North America existed in California. They were all destroyed. The last grizzly bear was killed in the Santa Ana Mountains of my home ground in 1903. So how does one begin to think about this? And certainly a large part of my permissions, if you will, and my concerns have to do with this presence of a landscape and how to think about landscape, how to bring yourself not only to the vocabulary of what landscape might be, but also to the senses of the tone of that vocabulary, the emotions of that vocabulary, and how to paint it. Literally how to paint it, phrase by phrase, as you're feeling it out in the writing. So that condition of being fascinated by the visual arts composes a large part of my experience of the writing. And I try to bring that to bear upon these narratives. Questions from back there, please, don't be afraid. Yes? Well, that was quite some number of years ago when I was primarily a kid in the late 1960s. I had been really very self-conscious about reading and writing. Though I wanted to read very much, I had suffered as a boy a terrible learning disability, and nobody in the family found out that I couldn't even read the simplest preposition until I was 10 or 11 years old, because I was so good I was very good at athletics, I was very graceful, I could memorize everything that was said to me, so I was able to hide this. And when it was discovered, my mother and another very gifted woman took 2 years to teach me how to read literally from the most basic drawing on a lap blackboard, or else I'd be dead by now. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And from that, watching not only them trace language on that blackboard, but watching myself trace language on that blackboard, I think that that process had a huge, or gave me a deep personal sense of how to make something with my hands. Literally, you know, how to draw a circle, how to draw, you know, the O, F of, and on that blackboard begin to pronounce it, and to pronounce it in a way that made sense to me, in the way that colors had already made sense to me, in the way that working with a brush or a pencil had made sense to me. And I suppose that, you know, the deeply felt experience about the making of letters and the making of from letters words really gave me a sense of the peculiar rhythms that I hear and feel, and with that peculiarity, even though it is peculiar, because if you're going to be an artist, you have to accept your peculiarities and move forward into it, no matter what the price, or you won't become artists. So I, you know, sensed the deep, abiding presence of those peculiarities from a very early point, and moved toward those peculiarities because, frankly, I didn't know what the fuck else to do. You know, that was the only way I was going to survive. And the only way I was going to find my way, no matter what it was, rather than going to war or going to prison, because I was a really violent, angry kid. You know, if you can't read, finally it really upsets you. So I had to find a way out of that anger and find a way into the making of an art. Very important for me. Well, when my ancestors came into California, they came in with the Crespi expedition in 1769.
Well, how did they come?
They came from Mexico. They were the first formal, forceful Spanish settlement to come into California. California, up until that point, had been a mystery. And just to give you a sense of what they witnessed as they came into Santa Barbara, for instance, were the Chumash swordfish dancers who were, in some ways, I suppose, not to be sentimental about it, extraordinary magical dancers, wearing feathers, paint. These were sand painters. These were people whose abiding formation of existence was initiated by the ingestion of what's called datura or tolachi. There was an ancient religion called the Chin-Inchkanich religion that was founded on Catalina Island. And these people, we don't even know anything about them because they burned all of their own goods and we robbed their graves in the 1870s. These people painted caves in both the Temblor Mountains above Santa Barbara and the mountains fronting the beginning of the San Joaquin Valley, and I consider those cave paintings. They did this with colored plant materials. These are some of the most beautiful abstract paintings I've ever seen. And all these people were destroyed. So you're looking at the destruction not only of land, as Carl Sauer might say, but also life. So when I think about California now, in San Diego where we live, there are 45 languages spoken in our neighborhood. You're looking at the border region, which is part of the Pacific Rim, and this border region is focused upon Tijuana. Tijuana is the largest border in the world, and by that I mean 250,000 people come through that border a day in Tijuana. So you have this presence between the United States or North America and Mexico. And as one of my close older friends told me, he'd been raised in Mexico City, you can think of really no two countries or communities who are sharing so much and if so fatally misunderstood each other in ways that are hardly conceivable. So as one looks at this region, in the whole of San Diego County, there are 95 languages spoken. So you get this remarkable presence of people, I think, in the process of forming a new dream. And many of the people that I know, many of the people that we spend our time with, are from South America or Central America. And believe me, these people think of their experiences as a deeply American experience, as you and I think of our experience. They are Americans too. So I think that we're obviously in a terrible transition. And last night we were listening to a poet that I consider very instructive and lovely poet named Wendell Berry. And he was talking about this crisis. Wendell Berry is a poet whose family settled in Kentucky and had been farming the same farm for over 200 years. Wendell Berry was a part of a whole group of writers who came to Stanford along with Telly Olson and Ken Kesey and many others, and has been in Kentucky for all of his life. And he said in this interview with Bill Moores last night, in relationship to the crisis that we're all experiencing, which brings us, a sense of I think, profound doubt about all of ourselves, that one of the things that we're all going to have to be is patient in an emergency. And that's really difficult. That's really very hard to be. When one thinks about the environmental crisis and other crises that are rising up before all of us. And how do we find a language for that and still understand that, that the presence of daily life and the rituals of daily life are what are our ground. I mean, when I think of apocalypse, I certainly, think of this word not only in relationship to John of Patmos, who wrote Revelations, but even more importantly, in my experience, I think of Blake, who redefined apocalypse in a way that I think is both deeply humane and at the same time deeply humorous and deeply liberating, because he said a true apocalypse can only come about through an improvement in sensual pleasure. And if one thinks about that apocalypse, that's completely different. That completely reorganizes one's mind, one's intelligence, and one's emotion before what a word might actually mean. Because most of us think of apocalypse, including myself, as some terrible moment that brings the end of time and all of the mess and discouragement of one being born in sin and all of these things that come with our civilization. Blake redefines the whole thing in this way and brings this gentle, profound humor to it that is completely absent in all of this. I mean, I'm often asked, as I think many authors and artists are often asked, about the anxiety of influence, to quote Harold Bloom. And I don't think of that at all as an anxiety, because so much of this sense never even considers the fact of a deep pleasure in making art, and what a deep pleasure it should and must be, because if you're not getting any pleasure from it, why do it? If it's only going to bring the other things. I mean, there are the other things that come along with it, but there's also this deep and abiding pleasure. I remember the poet Louis Zukowski wrote that the pleasure that is afforded in the making of a poem comes in 3 different levels in terms of sight, sound, and intellection. And the quality of that pleasure can be transferred to painting too, because painting, I think, and making sculpture or making videos also comes with these 3 elements of sight, sound, and intellection. And how is one to come to this and find an abiding sense of possibilities through that, which can, give you a place to stand and to feel at home And feeling at home, I think, is often one of the most difficult of all of the processes. When one thinks of the presence of the senses, certainly this is one of the most important presences of the senses, and this is the one, that can keep you from being poisoned. Certainly what your eyes see can poison you too, but if you have no sight, or if that is curtailed, one of the ways that you feel your world is through your tongue. You also talk with your tongue, make your language feasibly present with your tongue. So I think that it's not an adage. I think it's a truth of the experience of the body. I remember in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake said that the only way, the real mystery of the time that we're living in, we're living in the ages of the five senses, as Blake defined it, as other great writers, poets, artists, and visionaries have defined it. If you don't have this experience of the senses, I mean, that's what I regard as the opening presence to Blake's senses of apocalypse, that, a true apocalypse can only come about through an improvement in sensual pleasure. It has everything to do with the senses, because we seem to be an animal, a creature that needs this in levels that often are beyond our understanding. So this adage that you talk about, that the eye is the tongue, I think, tells you a real truth about living in your body, about how you experience the world and how you shape yourself before all the intonations and presences of sensuality that are available to you. I don't feel that at all. I think it's a trait of an invention of a culture that has backed itself into a corner and can't get out of it. I don't think that greed and violence are necessarily traits that we can embrace. When one looks at the ancient archaeological record, there is no violence as we know it. The real violence begins after the invention of agriculture. We see the really, truly unusual forms of predatory, distinctly lasting violence appear at around 8,000 or 9,000 BC in the Middle East and in other areas of South America, for instance. So I don't think it's an evolutionary trait at all. I think it's a trait that you learn in this kind of civilization, and I think that it's going to be a trait that's going to take a great deal of time. I often, in situations like this, try to propose a kind of model. I don't know if it's a model or a sense of time that one can bring to one's own regard about the time that you're living in. But I know among the ancient Indians, for instance, a group might have had a campground or a camping ground for generations, and the reason for that camping ground might have been a beautiful lake. And the women and the children of that tribe might have studied that lake and all of its life systems from one generation to another for thousands of years. And in that way came to know where they were with a deep intimacy. And to also recognize that if that lake were destroyed, how would one propose a healing for this? And perhaps for ourselves, as we think about it, because it may be the only way to think about it, it may be that we're going to have to project a process of healing that may take 5,000 to 10,000 years, that may have to begin now. You and I won't see it, but certainly those grandchildren of ourselves, of our progeny, will see it in that long a period of time. How does one think about this damage? How does one think about one's imaginative and physical position before this kind of crisis? And I don't really know of any other way to think about it other than to project a process of healing that won't take centuries. It may take more than centuries given what's taken place. And that is very important because it means that you and I can't do it in our lifetimes. It's really impossible. But it gives us a shape of time by which to imagine further work to be done. And I think that that's also extraordinarily important. What is the artist's work? Has the artist's work taken on a larger horizon of responsibilities in this process? And how is one to think about the nature of this responsibility or responsibilities as we all move forward? Thank you very much.